After weeks of stalemate, the Suez Crisis burst dramatically into the news again, for Israel has invaded Egypt. Britain and France have declared the canal in danger, and British and French troops are on the move. Background to these startling events is the running sore of the Israel-Egypt frontier, which has been a theater of sporadic warfare ever since the Israeli state came into being. For many years, even the village schools in the frontier settlements have known that at any moment, death may be looking over their shoulder. Death may be looking at death, 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 may be looking at death.
Speak about destruction! Speak about destruction! Speak about destruction!
Welcome to Blowback. I'm Brendan James.
I'm Noah Colwyn.
And this is episode 2 of our mini-series No Daylight, entitled Before Sunset. Last episode, we took you through the saga of Harry Truman and the recognition of the State of Israel. This episode will move into the 50s, into the Eisenhower administration and beyond. The Suez Crisis, the Kibbutz Massacre, and the firing on the USS Liberty set us up to see the relationship between the US and Israel somehow getting tighter, even as tensions increase. We'll have some brief sampling of what things were like during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations before we end the episode on a real turning point, when Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon upgrade Israel to an indispensable Cold War ally. Let's get to it.
I think there was a little bit of buyer's remorse in Washington when they saw the outcome of the 48 war. They realized that the refugee problem that had been created was going to be a problem for the future. They realized that American interest in the region had been compromised. In fact, there were revolutions led, or coup d'etat led by officers who'd fought in Palestine, which completely changed the complexion of the Middle East by 1958. Within 10 years, 3 major Middle Eastern countries, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, had changed regimes, largely or partly at least because of Palestine. So they foresaw something like this, or at least they saw that the stability that they wanted and the succession to Britain as the local hegemon might have been jeopardized. And so you have the United States voting under Truman for resolutions which would have returned refugees in December 1948. And not agreeing to support Israel in a variety of spheres, including votes in the UN Security Council, and not arming Israel. Israel is obliged, after the United States helped it with arms during the 48 war, as did the Russians. Israel is obliged to turn to Britain and France.
That was Professor Rashid Khalidi in an interview with us, explaining the, as he put it, buyer's remorse that almost immediately set in after the United States swiftly recognized the State of Israel in 1948. But it wasn't just Israel's relationship with its neighbors that was of concern to American statesmen. It was, of course, also Israel's subjugation of the Palestinian population that fell under its dominion after the war. In the 1950s, not to mention the present day, Israelis tended to understand the Palestinians who returned to attack Israeli settlements as infiltrators, which is still today the official term for any Palestinian who enters Israeli territory from the West Bank. As Benny Morris notes, quote, many of the infiltrators were refugees, former inhabitants of Arab villages and towns in the areas that had become the Jewish state, end quote.
Infiltrator was a broad term, which Israeli authorities took to include attackers of Israeli settlements and military facilities, as well as, for example, refugee Palestinian farmers who returned to their orchards with donkeys at night to harvest crops that they could not freely access in daylight. An unknown number of those who were caught by the Israelis and taken prisoner were tortured. Furthermore, as a matter of official policy, starting in 1949, the Israeli military began carrying out retaliatory raids to collectively punish Palestinians for the incursions.
Still, throughout the 1950s, there was a steady rise in the number of Palestinians making these unsanctioned trips across the border into Israel. One American diplomat at the time explained the matter simply. Unemployment, food shortages, and general living conditions on the Jordan side of the border are particularly bad. On the other hand, conditions on the Israel side are comparatively good, end quote.
Decades later, Morris affirmed this view, writing that, quote, most of the infiltrators were Palestinian refugees who crossed the border for economic or social reasons, to take crops or household objects, to smuggle goods, to visit relatives, or attempt to resettle in their former homes. A small minority of infiltrators crossed in order to kill Israelis or sabotage Israeli targets, end quote.
Inside Israel itself, however, this was not the impression. The Israeli press and the Israeli political leadership were consumed with stories and anxieties about murderous infiltrators, intent on carrying out spectacular acts of terrorist violence. In fact, infiltration was one of the top concerns of Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Quote, reprisals are imperative, he wrote in his diary in August 1953. There is no relying for our security on UN observers and foreign states. If we do not put an end to these murders now, the situation will get worse. How did U.S. policy toward Israel change from Truman to Eisenhower? Historian Doug Rossenow explained it to us as a kind of progression.
There was a continuity between Truman and Eisenhower on saying, we don't want to provide weapons. We don't want to have a military alliance with Israel. In fact, Truman and Eisenhower, under both administrations, the State Department sought to create regional alliances in the Middle East that would be modeled somewhat on NATO, that would put, the United States in alliance with friendly anti-communist nations in the Middle East. There were a series of schemes to do this. All of them excluded Israel because everybody understood that if Israel were included, then the Arab and Muslim states would not participate. In conventional terms, in the normal ways, a close security relationship with Israel, the United States government actually held Israel at arm's length.
But by the time Eisenhower came into power, Israel was starting to act in ways that provoked not only Arab and Muslim states, but Washington as well.
All hell broke loose in 1953. First, Israel started to divert water from the Jordan River away from this sort of shared watershed in the northeast that involved Syria and Lebanon and Jordan into Israel, and they were making a waterworks inside the demilitarized zone where they really had no business doing so. And this really created the initial diplomatic crisis with Eisenhower and Dulles saying, look, we're going to cut off aid to Israel over this. They've got to stop this. This is a violation of the Armistice Agreement from 1949. You can't just treat the demilitarized zone as if it's your territory and treat this shared watershed as if it's yours to divert for your usage unilaterally. But not many people knew that Eisenhower in 53 basically gave the order to, we're going to cut off aid to Israel until Israel stops this.
Additionally, Rossenow says that U.S. diplomats were aware of Israel's increasingly aggressive hand in dealing with so-called infiltrators, even if it didn't please Washington to learn it.
The UN observers tended to think and tended to report that they saw Israel as the main culprit in terms of state behavior in the region. I mean, that comes through in the documents. And there was an awareness of this in the U.S. State Department, even if the people at the top sometimes did and sometimes did not seem interested in hearing about it.
By the autumn of 1953, Israeli leaders were ready to level up this reprisal program. After the killing of an Israeli mother and her children in a grenade attack, David Ben-Gurion and his top advisors sent down the order, strike back. And the command went down to a new detachment, one that had been recently created for exactly this purpose. Unit 101, a commando group led by one Major Ariel Sharon. The Palestinian village of Kibbutz was to be his target. Later, in his autobiography, Sharon wrote that Kibiya was to be a lesson. I was to inflict as many casualties as I could on the Arab home guard. I was to blow up every major building in the town.
The tiny village of Kibiya on the Israel-Jordan border is in ruins as day survivors relate how troops from Palestine struck across the frontier at night. They accuse Israeli forces of leveling buildings with grenades, shellfire, and explosives, trapping entire families in the rubble. While his neighbors watch silently, a villager searches for the body of his boy. The attack prompts the United States, England, and France to deliver their sharpest rebuke to Israel since its founding and to demand stern action to punish the guilty troops. The boy, one of Kibiya's 66 victims, is carried away as the United Nations launches an investigation of the explosive tensions that walk the border.
Israeli soldiers went from house to house, throwing in grenades and spraying bullets. When Kibiya's villagers fled their homes, Israeli troops gunned them down outside. Quote, they shot every man, woman, and child they could find, then turned their fire on the cattle, reported Time magazine. Quote, after that, they dynamited 42 houses, a school, and a mosque. The cries of the dying could be heard amid the explosions.
The final toll was 69 dead Palestinians. For the 1950 to 1953 period as a whole, Morris estimates that several thousand Palestinians were killed by Israel in quote-unquote border violence, while 153 Israeli civilians were killed. The Israeli press dismissed the Kibiya slaughter as something like fake news, and Ben-Gurion shared a cover story blaming Jewish vigilantes, though he took 3 days to come up with it. In an interview, historian Rashid Khalidi situated this within the long, sordid history of British counterinsurgency theory.
Kibiya was a typical example, looking at it from the Israeli point of view, of the Israeli implementation of British counterinsurgency theory, which is you attack the population of any hostile group or a power or actor. You go after the militants, but you don't really care about killing them. If you can, you do. But what you're trying to do is put pressure on the whole society through attacks on civilians. And this is not an Israeli innovation. This is British counterinsurgency 101. Population-centric is the term that one military analyst has called it. You're not trying to get the militants as your first target. You're trying to get them, but your first target is the population. And this is laid down in British textbooks, and the Israelis drink it in like their mother's milk.
Riots broke out in Arab cities, including the Jordanian capital of Amman, where crowds threw stones at the British embassy, holding the Brits responsible for letting the Israelis run wild. Quote, Western diplomats, according to Morris, believed that Kibiya had seriously endangered Britain's position in Amman, and perhaps in the Middle East in general, end quote. With Britain's prestige so diminished, it was clear that the important response would be that of the United States, where Ben-Gurion had already ordered for Israel-sympathizing activists to be put to work.
The State Department's initial press release on Kibiya called the first reports of the massacre shocking. Already, Eisenhower and his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had planned to cut off aid to Israel as punishment for its illegal diversions of water. But in the wake of Kibiya, they went further, making this breach public and allowing the United Nations to go forward with condemnation of Israel.
In a cable to his ambassador to Egypt, written days later, Secretary Dulles showed that these decisions were made with the Arab world in mind. Quote, as Arabs must realize, the U.S. has taken a strong line on the Kibiya incident, and by withholding aid to Israel in connection with the water diversions, has shown its intention to back the United Nations by concrete action, end quote.
Like the anti-communist diplomat Loy Henderson back in Truman's day, Eisenhower and Dulles were concerned about pushing Israel's oil-rich neighbors into Soviet spheres of influence. In the early 1950s, the Middle East was looking mighty unstable. In 1952, A military coup in Egypt had thrown out the monarchist government installed by the British decades earlier. In 1953, DC and London had collaborated to overthrow an elected moderate nationalist government in Iran, the Westerners instead installing the Shah's dictatorship. And in 1954, Syria's government was also overthrown.
But after Kibiya, perhaps the biggest challenge that Washington would face in the Middle East was homegrown. It was the start of something that, in 1953, may not have seemed like much. The Kibiya massacre led directly to the foundation of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, better known as AIPAC.
It stimulated the creation of AIPAC. There's no question, even though at first the organization went by a slightly different name, the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs, which was formed in the spring of 1954. The Kibiya crisis was late October 1953, so pretty shortly after that. Zionists in the United States and elsewhere were initially shocked by the news of Kibiya. For the most part, they saw this and clearly thought, oh, this is bad. But they got over that really fast. As soon as they saw people criticizing Israel who were not Jewish, and particularly the U.S. government, in supporting UN Security Council condemnation of Israel. As soon as that happened, the most devoted Zionist activists led by Isaiah Kennan, known as Cy Kennan to his friends, and others in Washington and New York and elsewhere said, look, let's circle the wagons. We need to support Israel when it's under attack. And, there are two sides to this story, because you had all these, Arab interlopers, as they would have said, and, these Israeli settlers on a frontier locale, isolated, vulnerable, murdered. And, what do you expect? And they quickly rebounded, Kennan and other Zionist activists, from the initial shock over the news of the Kibiya massacre, which is what it was. Pretty quickly started to rally Jewish organizations, Zionist and non-Zionists, to a defense of Israel, telling Israel's side of the story. And this is known in the Zionist tradition, and it's discussed quite openly in Israel. This is known as Hasbara, right? Which literally means, explaining, but it's, public diplomacy, communications, PR, and sometimes, frankly, described as propaganda. That's what Hasbara means, to do propaganda for Israel, to tell Israel's side of the story. And this is what Zionists in the United States started to do pretty fast, like within a week or two after the news of the Kibiya massacre hit the headlines and was all over the newspapers. Started to say, we need to tell Israel's side of the story, but also to be more mobilized so that we can be proactive and help to prepare and preserve American public opinion in a way that's favorable to Israel. We can't just leave it to the Israelis to do and to speak in a way that's going to be positively received in the United States, because we see that they do things like this. They commit massacres and expect everybody to accept these kind of ridiculous lies, like David Ben-Gurion was telling you, oh, we didn't do it. The Israeli army didn't do that. It was just some Israeli citizens who were enraged over these marauding Arabs who just, I don't know, they took matters into their own hands. And, you can't exactly blame them, but, we didn't do it. There was a lie, and he was brazen about telling it.
Without meaningful repercussions for Israel, the Kibiya crisis was smoothed over by the passage of time. Although there had been riots in Jordan after the October 53 slaughter, 2 months later, a visiting reporter to Jordan noted that a complete calm had returned to the capital city of Amman, where weeks earlier, crowds had thrown stones at the British embassy.
The unprecedented global condemnation of Israel after the Kibiya massacre, writes Morris, changed the Israeli retaliation strategy. Israel shifted focus to, quote, Arab military objectives rather than villages and towns. Kibbia, Morris continues, can thus be said to have led to that series of Israeli strikes against the Egyptian army in 1954 and early 55, which in turn led to the Egyptian responses, which eventually triggered the 1956 Sinai-Suez War.
The Suez Canal, never far from the news in its 87 years of history, hits the headlines like a bombshell when, without a hint of warning, Egypt's premier, Colonel Nasser, announces that his country is taking it over.
In a reflection of how quickly the Soviet bloc had changed its tune on Israel, Nasser turned to Czechoslovakia for weapons, the same state that had sent guns and supplied the Zionists only a few years earlier. And once Egypt's leader nationalized European companies' control over the Suez Canal, Nasser was officially a headache not only to Eisenhower and Dulles, but also London and Paris.
France, writes historian Salim Yacoub, already angered by Nasser's support of the Algerian rebels, echoed Britain's insistence that the nationalization could not stand, quote. But Washington was firm, quote, the nationalization was deplorable, an insult, but acting by force would only make the problem worse.
As ever, Jerusalem had other ideas. Israel had shifted the focus of its retaliation policy from West Bank villages like Kibbia to the Egyptian border. Israeli aggression there had been part of Nasser's calculation in seeking heavy arms from Czechoslovakia. The largest Arab population nearby by a long shot, Egypt had always been understood by Israeli leaders as their most potentially dangerous neighbor. And now, Nasser's strained relations with Western powers, well, that presented an opportunity. France, after all, had stepped up and begun supplying Israel militarily since 1955, after the U.S. had declined to do so directly.
And so, in the early autumn of 1956, British, French, and Israeli officials began meeting secretly to plot a military seizure of the Suez Canal. Giving the Americans no notice, the three conspiring nations hoped to force a fait accompli on a disapproving Washington. Eisenhower, who was up for re-election in the first week of November, was much more than disapproving of the Israeli invasion and the British and French planes bombing Egypt. The Americans introduced a UN resolution that outright condemned the tripartite attack on Egypt. The Americans, furthermore, sided with the Soviet Union in demanding a withdrawal.
Ben-Gurion made speeches about we're going to stay here after they took Sinai. And they very briefly believed that they could get away with this, but the Americans very, very rapidly disabused them of that notion. No, you are not going to stay here. Though it took them until January, if I remember correctly, of 57 to get the Israelis out. It took months. The British and the French withdraw immediately. They realize they have screwed up. The governments fall. It's a catastrophe for British and French power. There are comparisons today to Suez, and the United States just had its Suez in this narrow straits, just as Britain and France had their Suez in the Suez Canal. Anthony Eden resigns and so on. But the Israelis are much tougher with the Americans. I mean, it's amazing. You have these two world powers, or previously world powers, who capitulate immediately, and Israel hangs tough for months with the Americans. And finally, Eisenhower just issues an ultimatum: get the hell out.
In response to the massacres, illegal invasions, and general chaos stemming from Israel's actions in the Middle East, President Eisenhower asked Congress for hundreds of millions of dollars for a new Middle East defense and aid program. It was a kind of mini Marshall Plan against communism in that part of the world, which Ike himself christened the Eisenhower Doctrine. But Israel, fresh off the Suez Crisis, and whose presence in any diplomatic arrangement with the Arab world was a non-starter, would not be part of such a package. And so when Dulles went to testify before Congress in January 57, with his hat in his hand, Zionist activists were ready to press Israel's case.
There was an organized response from the Israel lobby ready to go. On Capitol Hill, the pro-Israel lobbyist Cy Kennan and his colleagues played Democrats and liberals against the Eisenhower administration. They got allies like Senator Lyndon Johnson to slam the White House for not giving aid to Israel. This effort also included a letter signed by 70 Democratic congressmen, which framed the administration's reluctance to aid Israel as being soft on communism.
But the Israel lobby's intervention after Suez was not decisive. The U.S. wasn't really backing away from Israel or getting soft on communism. In fact, despite the shock of the Suez crisis, within weeks, Israel's pleas for security guarantees were finding sympathetic ears in the United States. Moscow's ongoing suppression of a revolt in Hungary no doubt made it easier to sell Americans on the case for an anti-communist, anti-Nasser bulwark in the Middle East.
But the Israel lobby was developing a low-key, tried-and-true strategy that would pay bigger dividends in a few decades, when Israel would actually become a close security partner of the United States. As one American diplomat later put it, quote, "Not until the mid-1960s did overt, organized Jewish political activity on behalf of the State of Israel come into its own."
By the time that Lyndon Johnson took office in November 63, writes historian Doug Little, quote, "The hope that a strong Israel might serve as a pro-Western bulwark against future Soviet gains in the Middle East, and the fear that a weak Israel might go nuclear, had combined to lay the groundwork for a special relationship that was cemented by the 1967 Six-Day War."
Israel was not an ally of the United States in the late 40s or the 50s or the first few years of the 1960s. With this obsession with Vietnam, with this Cold War framing, with a search for American proxies who can go up against Soviet proxies, Israel comes to be seen as an ally. Israel comes, even though it's not formal, there's no formal alliance, comes to be seen as a weapon against Soviet influence in the Middle East. And the Israelis, who are really good at this stuff, they sell this to the Americans. This bill of goods is sold to the Americans. The Americans buy it.
Under John F. Kennedy in 1962, the U.S. began selling missiles to the Israelis with the misguided expectation that that would push Israel toward peace agreements with the Palestinians and neighboring Arab states. It also served as a counterbalance to U.S. efforts under JFK to halt or slow down Israel's drive to acquire nuclear weapons, an American effort to stop Israel that ultimately failed. In any case, as Rossinow explains, it would be in Lyndon Johnson's presidency that Israel really rose up in Washington's esteem.
Johnson absorbed this completely, but even more than many other Democrats in his era, often talked about his strong feelings for the state of Israel in a way that today, again, would validate critical scholarship about shared histories of settler colonialism in the United States and Israel. Johnson loves to talk about, Israel is just like the American frontier. It's like the Old West, and Johnson loved that kind of like frontier imagery. He used it all the time in talking about the Vietnam War, the U.S. war in Vietnam, that, it's just like we're settlers in the Old West, and, the Indians, they're threatening us.
Yeah, get rid of the barbarians.
Yeah, you would say, when talking about Vietnam, in justifying escalation and expansion of the U.S. war, he would say, we've kept the shotgun above the mantle and the shells in the jar for too long.
I think Brandeis, his earlier speeches in support of Israel, he made the exact same, really for an American audience, he made the very case that what the Jews are doing in Palestine is just like what good old-fashioned America remembers about clearing out the Indians, and that was excised from his collected speeches a couple decades later, when that was no longer maybe for Lyndon Johnson, but for others, not so much the analogy to be drawing. And
That's so cool.
Rashid Khalidi elaborates.
Johnson is a man with no knowledge of the world. Johnson is a domestic politician par excellence, even more so than was Harry Truman, and a deeply committed Zionist, at least in the sense that all of his friends who knew anything about this were Zionists.
The irony, of course, was that throughout the 1960s, Israel went directly against American policy in its aggressive, clandestine effort to build its own nuclear weapons program. Through a corporation founded by an American Zionist businessman, Israel stole enriched uranium from a Pennsylvania plant. With this fissile material, Israel was able to build a nuke by 1967, though it would not become known as a nuclear power for years to come.
1967 was a pivotal year for Israel. In June, it struck and defeated its Arab neighbors, subsequently making new territorial gains against Egypt in the Sinai, Syria in the Golan Heights, and Jordan in the West Bank. While regard for Israel had been rising in the West for years, this Six-Day War, as it became known, demonstrated that Israel was a military power with no equal in the Middle East. But there was one troubling incident for America, an episode that would haunt the special relationship for years afterward.
Patrolling off the Sinai coast, writes journalist James Bamford, the USS Liberty was a reconnaissance ship, with personnel from the National Security Agency observing what Israeli forces were then doing in the Egyptian city of El Arish. As the Liberty sat within eyeshot of El Arish, Bamford writes, quote, Israeli soldiers turned the town into a slaughterhouse, systematically butchering their prisoners. An eyewitness recounted how, in the shadow of the El Arish Mosque, they lined up about 60 unarmed Egyptian prisoners, hands tied behind their backs, and then opened fire with machine guns until the pale desert sand turned red, end quote.
What happened next was, for decades, a closely held, if widely suspected, secret. Israeli forces attacked the Liberty, killing 34 and wounding 171 on board. The Israelis quickly told the Americans that it had been a mistake, that they had thought the ship was Egyptian, though multiple witnesses claimed the ship had been flying an American flag. According to Bamford, quote, despite the overwhelming evidence that Israel had attacked the ship and killed the American servicemen deliberately, the Johnson administration and Congress covered up the entire incident, end quote. In the words of a former director of naval intelligence, quote, the Navy was ordered to hush this up, say nothing, allow the sailors to say nothing. The Navy rolled over and played dead, end quote.
1968, after all, was an election year. The Israelis had said they had made a mistake and promised a swift investigation. And, accepting the Israelis' explanation, Washington had no trouble continuing this collaboration. It was not worth spoiling a friendship over some dead sailors and dead Egyptians. There were bigger things ahead. Oh, thanks for giving me this one, Brendan.
No problem.
What the Christ is wrong with the Jews, Bob? This age-old question was memorably posed by President Richard Nixon in his first term to his political confidant, H.R. Bob Haldeman, in 1971. Nixon carried with him a paranoid anti-Semitism, one that went well beyond the quotidian prejudice of, say, Harry Truman, and locked in perfectly with Nixon's self-pitying and conspiratorial thinking that fueled so many key features of his administration. American Jews were, to Nixon, left-wing, subversive, and most of all, personally disloyal, with one major exception. Dr. Henry Kissinger, whom Nixon revered, and who had become something of a co-president when it came to foreign affairs and Cold War strategy.
Not only did Nixon's personal anti-Semitism not interfere with his relationship with Kissinger, it also posed no problem for his relationship with Israel. While Nixon had no special place in his heart for Zionism per se, Israel was by the early 1970s an increasingly important chess piece in Nixon's grand Bismarckian conception of the Cold War's balance of power. Israel was not yet in the special relationship with America that we conceive of today, not until 1973, during the Arab-Israeli War, or the October War, or the Yom Kippur War.
It is an all-out war. That's how Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan describes an invasion of the Golan Heights and the east bank of the Suez by Syria and Egypt. The surprise attacks came early this morning in the air and on the ground. The Egyptians apparently have taken control of at least a portion of the east bank of the Suez.
That was Tom Brokaw behind the desk at NBC reporting the outbreak of the war. Incidentally, throughout his entire opening segment, the Exxon brand pulsated at the bottom of the screen. The American oil giant was, at that point, one of the major corporate sponsors of NBC News.
Egypt and Syria struck at the Israeli-occupied territories of the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, respectively. In the early moments of this latest showdown between the Soviet-backed Arab states and the American-backed Jewish state, the latter was faltering. Nixon writes of this moment in his memoirs. By the end of the first day of fighting, the Egyptians had crossed the Suez Canal and begun a thrust into the Sinai. In the north, the Israelis were pushing the Syrians back in the Golan Heights, but they were unable to rout them as they had in earlier conflicts. Israeli losses were heavy. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, however, was confident that if the Israelis had 3 or 4 days in which to mount a counteroffensive, they could turn the military tide on both fronts. We had convened a special meeting of the UN Security Council right after the fighting began, but there was little interest on either side in holding ceasefire discussion. The Soviets objected to our having called the Security Council into session. They clearly thought that the Arabs would win the war on the battlefield if they had enough time to secure their early victories. The French and the British, also Security Council members, were trying to stay at arm's length. They did not share our uniquely close ties with Israel, and they knew that Arab oil was at stake in this confrontation.
Prime Minister Golda Meir prepared nuclear warheads to strike against the Arab states that were daring to reclaim Israeli-occupied land. Kissinger, meanwhile, tried and failed to sweet-talk the U.S.-friendly Arab states, such as Jordan, from joining in. When meeting with congressional leaders, Nixon was asked, quote, "Is Israel going to lose?" The president replied, "No, we will not let Israel go down the tubes."
Dayan says it would take several days to drive them out of there, attributing the initial Egyptian successes to the thin line of Israeli defenses in that area. Egypt maintains it has taken control of the entire beach.
The plan to save Israel from said tubes was christened Operation Nickel Grass, a massive airlift of over 22,000 tons of weapons to America's friend. The Azores Islands, which listeners may remember as a key NATO station, courtesy of Portuguese dictator Antonio Salazar, served as a forward base. This extraordinary and unprecedented military commitment inaugurated the new era, what we now think of as the unconditional relationship between the United States and Israel, which in this moment gained the upper hand against the Soviet-backed Arab forces within just a few days. Israel and its supporters could now claim, having done so, that the Jewish state was not engaged in a regional war against hostile Arabs. It was now an indispensable ally in the wider Cold War, protecting U.S. interests against Soviet puppets and terror groups. Under this framing, what was good for Israel was good for America.
That was the framing. But the 1973 oil embargo, launched by the Arab nations of OPEC against any country supporting Israel's war effort, didn't feel so good for America. with Saudi Arabia, which was blessed with a quarter of the world's oil reserves, refusing to produce and sell to the oil-importing U.S., prices spiraled upward, and the American economy felt the tremblings of what was termed the first modern oil shock. It would not be the last time that U.S.-Israeli actions led to one.
A year after the airlift and the resulting oil embargo, no less than the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General George Brown, got himself in hot water speaking at Duke University. "We have the Israelis coming to us for equipment," he recalled of the previous year's war. "We say we can't probably get the Congress to support a program like this. And they say, don't worry about the Congress. We'll take care of the Congress." This is somebody from another country, but they can do it. And it was the next part of Brown's remarks that got him reprimanded by President Gerald Ford, who had since replaced Richard Nixon. They own, the banks in this country, the newspapers.
Brown apologized the next day, according to the New York Times, saying, among other things, quote, "I do in fact appreciate the great support and the deep interest in the nature of our security problems and our defenses that the American Jewish community has steadily demonstrated," end quote. But just 1 year later, it was Gerald Ford himself who would be savaged by his own Congress for daring to propose a reassessment of America's commitments to Israel.